شكرا سعادة المهندس ياسر بن سليمان الداود وكيل وزارة النقل للتخطيط والمعلومات. بسم الله وعلى بركة الله نبدأ معكم جدول الأعمال اليوم الثاني من المؤتمر اللوجستي السعودي بعرض عنوانه التحديات والفرص الدولية لتحقيق الخدمات اللوجستية والتجارة الناجحة عبر القارات والثقافات المختلفة. يقدم هذا العرض الامين العام لمعهد تشارترد الدولي للنقل واللوجستيات بالمملكة المتحدة السيد كيث نيوتن.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's a pleasure to be here with you. I was here last year for the same conference, and it was very encouraging last year to see the progress being made in Saudi, particularly with the government involvement in the conference. And again this year, I can see progress in the last 12 months. And it's great to be part of that. We live in a challenging world, and to work effectively in that challenging world as professionals, I believe we need understanding, learning and sharing. And I hope this morning I can do a little bit of that with you to help you understand and learn a little bit more about working across borders and cultures. Who am I? Well, I am the Secretary General of the Chartered Institute of Logistics and Transport. I'm very privileged to be in that role. We have 35 different institutes across the world, principally in Europe, Africa and Asia. And as part of that role, which I've been doing for 7 years now, I get the chance to work across different cultures and across different countries. And that's a very privileged position to be in, particularly given my background as a supply chain professional. So I worked, as you can see, you may be aware of the brand Cadbury. I have seen some here, Cadbury chocolate. So I worked, thank you. I worked in Cadbury for 20 years in various roles, started running distribution centres, running factories, in supply chain director roles, in global best practice roles. So my firm belief taking that into the Institute is we achieve our success in the logistics and supply chain world by working through people. So who I am, what I stand for, and how can we work together is a critical area within supply chain logistics. And for you today, it's about who we are, what we stand for, and how we can work together. And that plays critically across the world today. I should say actually that we've been working, so we don't actually have an institute in Saudi Arabia. We would love to have an institute here, but we've been working with Melly here for 12 years in the training in education area, delivering our certificates, our diploma programs, and we're very excited earlier in this year to have our certificate program recognised at a government level. So let us turn to what I plan to talk about. I want to talk about the realities of international trade today. As I said, we live in a challenging world. To help us to do that, I believe we need to understand geography, culture, language and history. So I should talk a little bit about that. And I'll bring you some case studies, just some short case studies about how we operate as an institute and how we seek to influence policy. Now for you, take that into the Saudi context, I think. I'll give you some specific country examples for us as an institute helping both industry and at a government level. But take that into a Saudi context. I know you have a number of organisations that work at that level, so you can replicate that here. And then, as an individual, also think about how you can work as a supply chain professional across that changing world. We have these statements as an institute, and equally I think they apply to us as individual supply chain professionals. So as an institute, I'll explain some of these terms. We are a professional membership body. We are modally agnostic. Now, that's quite complex, but what that essentially means, in the Chartered Institute of Logistics and Transport, we cover from rail, road, air, sea, ports, bus, coach. So we don't have a specific bias towards one form of transport. We're apolitical, and that is very important, and I'll talk more about that. And we seek to be evidence-based and impartial. So we're not a political organisation, we're not a trade association, and we're not a lobbying association. And again, I think as professionals, we, in the supply chain, the great benefit that we have as individuals is that we work in a world where sharing is common. We don't, unlike our colleagues in the commercial world, where we often have commercial considerations to take place, they are less in the supply chain world. And we can be evidence-based and we can be impartial. So think about that, about how you operate and how you might operate in Saudi. I want to talk then a little bit about the global world that we live in. Goes back, and we've had 4 decades now of globalization. We live in a global world. 40% of GDP is cross-border trade globally. Larger in some areas than other areas, but it's very much now a situation of globalization. That applies to services as well as goods, perhaps slightly less so, but services have started to catch up. As supply chain professionals, I'm sure you operate in worlds where you cross countries and borders in terms of your communication and how you work. And we find that particularly in our institute terms across our 35 countries. There's a real thirst for knowledge and education and understanding. And as a supply chain world, we tend to be fairly open about how we share and how we learn. And I think this conference here today is a great example of that. But we have moved in the last 10 years into some fairly significant challenges on that global world that we're operating in, and they are increasing in their significance. Globalization effectively has stalled, particularly in the last couple of years. There are a number of reasons behind that. Regionalization tends to be trade regionally tends to work better than globally. And you can see the example at the top there about the European Union. So 63% of EU trade is internal to the European single market. Very high proportion. I'll give you some more numbers on that and other regions in a minute. So we tend to have removed regional barriers, but global barriers are harder to remove. I speak personally, you probably recognise that my base is in the UK. We are embarking on what effectively is a political move called Brexit. I couldn't avoid talking about Brexit here today because that's such a big factor in our UK market. But as a UK PLC, we will struggle to replace some of that European trade as we move into the global trade. And there are more barriers and more things to overcome when you do that. So trade barriers and protectionism are also big factors in the last 2 years across China, America. We talk about trade wars now. We didn't talk about those 3 or 4 years ago. And in other environments too, that is spreading. Digitization, I know a lot of speakers this morning, yesterday, were talking about the opportunities in the technological side. We still find when we look at trade across country borders that some of the physical barriers still exist. Again, with Brexit, that's a big factor in Northern Ireland and Southern Ireland, where we're finding that whilst theoretically we could move goods with no border posts and with no paperwork, theoretically, in reality, that is not happening as it perhaps should. And a lot of that is around the capability and confidence at our country exits and our country entries. So globalization has stalled. Backdrop on this is an interesting slide, I always think, in terms of how trade and the economic center of gravity has changed over the years. And this is a McKinsey slide, but it moved in the 19th and 20th century west and is now moving rapidly east. And that's a big factor, I think, for Saudi, particularly in terms of its trade. This slide, I also think, has a lot of information on it globally. So you have trade being concentrated in regions, so global trade, but still heavy regionalization. Those regional markets, you can see the 63% in the EU I mentioned earlier. And then in Asia Pacific, the Asia area, so a lot of manufacturing that has crossed borders, China, outsourcing to and countries receiving products through China businesses, through other countries like Vietnam and Bangladesh. And then the Americas also, with strong regional trade. And then you look, I like to zoom in on Middle East and North Africa. Here, the size of the GDP in terms of trade, only 5% of global exports and 4% of global imports. But that trade has moved east. So in 1999, 40% of the trade from the MENA countries was with Asia. Last year, it was 55%. Regional trade is very low, and there's a lot of factors in MENA for that. There's tariffs, tend to be higher tariffs, higher non-tariff barriers like custom controls, and also the political situation. But the task here in Saudi is to get your logistics and supply chain to integrate more into global value chains. There was an IMF report in 2016 about the areas to move in terms of moving from oil dependency to adding more value into exports, which is the journey you are on, that still requires, according to that IMF report, improvement in technological capacity, greater efficiency in production, higher technical and managerial skills, and competitive wages. So quite a suite of things to work on to drive you and drive that value in what you're manufacturing and what your services, and also what predominantly what you're exporting, to drive that greater value and to drive global value into that whole equation. There's some pictures there. The the threats that we face, and I'm not going to talk in detail about these, but protectionism and populism, so Brexit and the trade wars, and then political events, Hong Kong hugely being impacted by politics at the moment, which from being one of the global centres of the world will be really struggling now in terms of continuing that reputation and continuing that critical global hub role that it has. So I said I'd talk a little bit about geopolitics. I think it's more to try and encourage you to understand here. History does have an enormous impact on what we do. Richard Nixon once famously said to the China Prime Minister, "What is the impact of the French Revolution?" And 200 years later, the China Prime Minister said, "It's too soon to tell." So actually, history, 200 years after events, has impacts on what we do. And understanding that as professionals, it's important. We should understand, and we shouldn't be arrogant. We shouldn't impose our values or our cultures in areas we don't understand. And I particularly know that when I travel around. So I come with a British European culture. It's important that I understand the environments I'm walking into and I'm working with. And we ignore that at our peril. And there's a few things up there in terms of recognizing some of the changes of the world and some of the history. We've got a very recent institute in Kazakhstan, and I think that's a good example of working across barriers. Kazakhstan is sandwiched between two great powers, Russia and China. They've been very clever in how they've recognized that position with centuries of history going into that. The rail gauge in Kazakhstan switches at the Chinese border from being the Russian rail gauge to the Chinese rail gauge. And I said to them on my first visit, well, why don't you just simply change the rail gauge? The answer to that was, do you think Beijing want Russian military to arrive in Beijing on a railway? And similarly, do you think that the people living in Moscow want Chinese military to arrive on a railway overnight in the middle of Moscow? Real factors, real historical factors, and they've been very clever in terms of setting up within the Belt and Road the Khorgos and other border centres, dry ports, and creating their geographical centre of supply chain expertise in Kazakhstan. A couple of books. This is Mark Miller, so some of the material I've been referencing here comes from Mark. So Mark is a fellow of our institute. Very interesting insights into Asia. And another book I'd recommend, so read and understand, is Prisoners of Geography by Tim Marshall. If you want to understand a bit about the geopolitical, historical factors that play into our trading world. So how do we respond? I'm going to quickly run through some case studies on how we might respond as professionals. We have a role, and that's the first important thing to understand. We can be a force to good, we have knowledge, and we can influence and help governments and businesses in trading across borders. The UK example I'll give, we have a long history in the Institute, founded 100 years ago in the UK, and we've had a policy unit for 20 years there. And we seek within the UK to help to shape policy through thought leadership, through facts, through evaluation. We do that in a number of ways. You can see there we're influencing government thinking in terms of transport planning, the DFT, the Department for Transport. So again, similarly, you've got a department here. And as professionals, it's very good to see the two sides here at this conference, understanding each other and using the expertise in the supply chain world and supply chain professionals here. I'll mention Brexit again. Brexit, I said, was political. So that means that our role, and we are meeting weekly with governments as a CILT in the UK. The great problem we've had is trying to understand those flows through Dover. So you can see the volume, 6,000 vehicles a day flow in and out of Dover. At the moment, they have no stop for any custom paperwork for it. They have some security checks, but you add on 5 minutes to each of those 6,000 vehicles coming through, and actually in reality it will be 25 minutes, and immediately you've got, you might see it in the bottom picture there, the traffic jams that will be created, vast car parks of vehicles, both in France and the UK. The government really did not understand that. In fact, one of our transport ministers didn't really even understand that Dover was the main point of entry into the UK. And so as a professionals, we shouldn't criticise that, we should seek to influence that. And that's where I would encourage you as professionals to work with your governments and with your politicians. So, bit more facts there in terms of how we've done that. Again, as an institute, and again, replicate that into the Saudi situation. So, how can you influence in the Saudi situation? You have professional bodies here that can converse and talk to governments, and throughout that bottom bullet there, demonstrate that you are modally agnostic and that you can provide evidence-based leadership. We have about 6 countries across the world who I would say are very good at doing this. So I picked out 2 others. Sri Lanka is an example. Sri Lanka is a logistics hub, very aware of the criticality of being in the global supply chain. And they've developed in Colombo, in the Institute, links with a number of government organisations. The way they do that is to advocate policy. They do it in a practical way in terms of papers, engagement, and events like this. So fairly straightforward and fairly simple, but difficult to start from scratch. You need to build up a reputation. You need to make sure that those papers and those meetings are worthwhile for the people that you're talking to. And that's an example of some of the areas, so anything from buses through to national policy. Singapore, quite different. I chose this example because Singapore is in the Global World Bank Lead Logistics Index is number 1. We have a small but very influential institute in Singapore in that global logistics hub. We're influencing, for example, in their port in 2030. And if you want an example of how they are building, they call this the new generation port. It's a completely new port that's being set up that will be highly automated, will actually communicate to shipping coming into the port, will have the ability to slow shipping down, speed it up so that the timing on arrival is right, will have then automatic offloading, and that's the aspiration, AGVs, etc. And if you want an example in terms of, well, how you might build that capability here in Saudi Arabia, have a good look at Singapore Port 2030, very much within your time frames here in Saudi. So, just finishing off now. I wanted to encourage you really in this short time. We are entering a different era. We have capability, professionalism and expertise to influence and support governments and businesses and help them as professionals. Take pride in that. Here in Saudi, with your 2030 vision, it's very important for you to remain globally engaged. There are international practices and logistics competencies that you can seek to understand and share. There's infrastructure, there's hubs and ports where the technology is key. And understanding that from a global context will help you as you move on that pathway, which I know you're doing around logistics hubs. And then training and education, that is always my theme, because it's my strong belief that we can have as much technology and we can build as much infrastructure as we like, but like Chinese are finding out now, you've got to match that with skills, training and education. And I know that focus is been seen here in Saudi, but keep that focus on training and education. So we are professionals. We should understand and we should be willing to share, and then those behaviours long term can make a difference in your world in Saudi Arabia and in our world globally. So thank you very much for listening to me this morning. I hope that was helpful, and do come and see me if you've got any points. I'll be around for the rest of the day. Thank you very much.